In the final days of World War II, something happened that defied every rule of warfare. Picture this: American soldiers fighting alongside German troops, French politicians grabbing rifles, and a tennis champion vaulting castle walls under enemy fire. This isn't fiction. This is the story of the Battle of Castle Itter, where the impossible became reality and enemies became allies in the most unlikely last stand of the entire war. May 5th, 1945. Hitler was dead. Germany was crumbling. The war in Europe had mere days left. Yet in the Austrian mountains, one final battle was about to unfold that would rewrite everything we thought we knew about World War II. This wasn't just any battle. This was the only recorded engagement in the entire war where American and German forces fought side by side against a common enemy, the Waffen-SS. What you're about to hear sounds like something straight out of a Hollywood movie, but every word of this story is true. And by the end, you'll understand why this battle represents something far greater than just another military engagement. It was a moment when the very soul of humanity triumphed over the darkness of war. The setting for this extraordinary tale was Castle Itter, a 19th century fortress perched high on a rocky outcrop in the Austrian Alps. But this wasn't just any castle. By 1943, the Nazis had transformed this once peaceful residence into something far more sinister, a prison for France's most valuable political prisoners. The castle's transformation began in 1940, when the Reich government leased it from its owner. But by February 7th, 1943, SS Lieutenant General Oswald Pohl had seized the property entirely under Heinrich Himmler's direct orders. What followed was the conversion of this historic castle into a specialized detention facility operated as a subcamp under the administration of the notorious Dachau concentration camp. The location was perfect for a prison. Sitting atop a 666-meter knoll at the entrance to the Brixental Valley, the castle commanded sweeping views of the surrounding countryside. Any escape attempt would be visible for miles. The medieval structure, with its thick stone walls and strategic position, had been extensively renovated in the late 19th century. Before the war, it had been a place of culture and refinement. Franz Liszt had stayed there. Tchaikovsky had orchestrated compositions within its walls. But by 1943, that artistic atmosphere had been replaced by the harsh reality of Nazi imprisonment. The prisoners held at Castle Itter weren't ordinary captives. These were the cream of French political, military, and cultural elite, men and women whose names had shaped the destiny of nations. Former Prime Ministers Édouard Daladier and Paul Reynaud, the leaders who had guided France through the early days of the war. General Maurice Gamelin, the commander who had led French forces during the phony war. Maxime Weygand, another former commander-in-chief, whose strategic mind had once been France's hope against German invasion. But the roster of prisoners read like a who's who of European prominence. There was Jean Borotra, the tennis champion, who had thrilled crowds across the continent before becoming a political figure in Vichy France. François de la Roque, the right-wing leader who had commanded the Croix de Feu movement. Léon Jouhaux, the trade union leader whose voice had spoken for millions of French workers. Marie-Agnès de Gaulle, the sister of Charles de Gaulle himself. These weren't just prisoners of war. They were living symbols of France's past and potentially its future. The conditions for these VIP prisoners were remarkably comfortable compared to standard concentration camps. They slept in converted guest rooms rather than barracks. They had access to the castle's substantial library, filled with books that had once entertained aristocratic visitors. Daily exercise was taken in a courtyard built around a 13th century fountain, a reminder of the castle's medieval origins. Yet despite this relatively privileged treatment, every prisoner understood the precarious nature of their situation. As the war drew to a close and Nazi Germany faced inevitable defeat, their value as bargaining chips might quickly transform into liability. The possibility of execution loomed over them all. By early May 1945, the situation at Castle Itter had become increasingly unstable. The Reich was collapsing. Communication lines were breaking down. Supply chains had virtually ceased to exist. On May 2nd, when the former commandant of Dachau, Édouard Weiter, died under suspicious circumstances at the castle, the current prison commander Sebastian Wimmer began to fear for his own life. Within hours, Wimmer abandoned his post entirely. The SS guards who had maintained control over the facility quickly followed suit, leaving the prisoners to fend for themselves. But these weren't ordinary prisoners. These were men and women who had once commanded armies, led nations, and shaped the course of European politics. They immediately took control of the castle and armed themselves with whatever weapons the fleeing guards had left behind. Yet they knew their freedom was temporary at best. Roaming bands of Waffen-SS troops were still operating in the area, and the castle's strategic position made it an obvious target. Without help, they would soon face a far worse fate than imprisonment. The first rescue attempt began with an unlikely hero, Zvonimir Čučković, a Yugoslav communist resistance member who had been working as a handyman at the prison, volunteered for a desperate mission. Under the pretense of running an errand for the now absent commander, he slipped away from the castle and began a 40-mile journey to Innsbruck. His goal was simple: find American forces and convince them to mount a rescue operation. Čučković's journey was fraught with danger. The roads were filled with retreating German units, roaming SS patrols, and desperate soldiers who might shoot first and ask questions later. But somehow he made it through, eventually encountering the 409th Infantry Regiment of the US 103rd Division. His urgent plea for help was heard, and though the American troops couldn't immediately authorize an attack, they began planning a rescue mission. The first attempt was ambitious. A heavily armored rescue force was assembled and began moving toward Castle Itter. But as they advanced past Jenbach, roughly halfway to their destination, they came under heavy artillery fire. The shelling was so intense that the mission had to be recalled. Only 2 jeeps carrying auxiliary personnel were able to continue, but they lacked the firepower necessary to mount an effective rescue. With the first rescue attempt having failed, the situation at Castle Itter became increasingly desperate. That's when the prison's Czech cook, Andreas Krobot, stepped forward with an even more dangerous proposition. He would bicycle to the town of Wörgl, hoping to make contact with any Allied forces or local resistance fighters who might be able to help. It was a suicide mission by any reasonable measure, but Krobot understood that time was running out. Armed with a hastily written note explaining the situation, Krobot set off on his bicycle in the middle of the day on May 4th. The roads were dangerous, filled with retreating German forces and roaming SS units who would shoot anyone they considered suspicious. But Krobot's humble appearance as a cook on a bicycle allowed him to avoid detection. He successfully reached Wörgl, where he made contact with Austrian resistance fighters who had recently taken control of the town after Wehrmacht forces had withdrawn. It was here that fate intervened in the most extraordinary way. The resistance fighters brought Krobot to Major Josef Gangl, a Wehrmacht officer who had made one of the most remarkable transformations of the entire war. Major Josef Gangl was not your typical German officer. Born in Bavaria in 1910, he had spent years fighting on some of the most brutal battlefields of the Second World War. He had commanded artillery batteries during the invasion of Ukraine, earning both classes of the Iron Cross. He had survived the horrors of the Eastern Front, witnessed the carnage of Normandy, and somehow made it through the desperate fighting in the Battle of the Bulge. By any measure, he was a seasoned combat veteran who had served his country with distinction. But something had changed in those final months of the war. Perhaps it was the mounting evidence of Nazi atrocities. Perhaps it was the realization that Germany's cause had become irredeemably corrupted. Or perhaps it was simply the moral awakening that comes to some men when they witness too much senseless death. Whatever the reason, Gangl had reached a breaking point. When ordered to retreat with his unit and join SS forces, he made a choice that would define the rest of his short life. He refused. Instead of following orders, Gangl had thrown in with the Austrian resistance movement in Wörgl. He provided weapons and intelligence to local fighters who were preparing to resist any SS attempts to terrorize the civilian population. It was an act of open defiance that could have cost him his life had the wrong people discovered it. But for Gangl, the choice was clear. He would rather die fighting against the SS than live serving them. When Andreas Krobot arrived with news of the desperate situation at Castle Itter, Gangl immediately understood the stakes. These weren't just any prisoners. They were the future leadership of France, men and women who would play crucial roles in rebuilding Europe after the war. But Gangl also knew that his small force of 10 to 20 loyal Wehrmacht soldiers wouldn't be nearly enough to defend the castle against a determined SS assault. That's when Gangl made another extraordinary decision. He grabbed a white flag, climbed into his Kübelwagen, and drove toward the nearest American positions. It was an act of incredible courage. He was driving through territory filled with trigger-happy soldiers from both sides, any of whom might shoot first and ask questions later. But Gangl understood that the situation required desperate measures. The American unit he encountered was the 23rd Tank Battalion of the 12th Armored Division, commanded by Captain John Lee Jr. Lee was everything you'd expect from an American tank commander in 1945. A stocky 27-year-old from Norwich, New York. He was a graduate of Norwich University, who had earned his reputation leading Company B across France and into Germany. His men called him Captain Jack, and he had the cigars, whiskey, and rough language to match the nickname. Lee had 4 Sherman tanks under his command, all M4A3 Sens that had carried him through the hills of France and across the Rhine. His tank, nicknamed Besotten Jenny after a cheating girlfriend, had become legendary among his crew. These weren't green recruits. They were battle-hardened veterans who had fought their way across Europe, earning Bronze Stars and the respect of their enemies along the way. The meeting between Gangl and Lee represented something unprecedented in the history of warfare. Here was a German major, still wearing the uniform of the Wehrmacht, approaching an American tank commander with a proposal for military cooperation. In any other circumstance, it would have been unthinkable. But these weren't ordinary circumstances. The war was effectively over. Hitler was dead, and both men understood that they were facing an enemy that transcended national boundaries. Lee's decision to trust Gangl and agree to the mission speaks volumes about both his character and his tactical intelligence. He could have easily dismissed the German officer as a potential trap or a desperate attempt at deception. Instead, he saw an opportunity to save lives and strike a blow against the SS, the organization that even many German military officers had come to despise. The alliance that formed between these two men would be tested in ways neither could have imagined. But first, they had to get to Castle Itter alive. Lee's initial force was modest but formidable. Along with Gangl's Wehrmacht soldiers, he had assembled a mixed group of American tankers and infantry. The irony was not lost on anyone involved. In an era when racial segregation was still official U.S. military policy, Black American soldiers were about to fight alongside German troops against a common enemy. The journey to Castle Itter began with Lee conducting a personal reconnaissance of the target. Together with Gangl and local resistance leader Hagleitner, he drove to the castle in the Major's Kübelwagen to assess the tactical situation. What they found was both encouraging and alarming. The castle's medieval fortifications provided excellent defensive positions, but its isolated location made it vulnerable to siege tactics. The SS forces in the area were estimated at over 100 men, well-armed and highly motivated. Lee had originally planned to bring additional tanks and supporting infantry from the recently arrived 142nd Infantry Regiment, but as the rescue column prepared to depart, they encountered an obstacle that would drastically reduce their strength. A bridge along the route proved too flimsy to support the weight of multiple Sherman tanks. Lee was forced to make a difficult decision. He would proceed with a much smaller force rather than risk losing his entire command to a bridge collapse. The final rescue force was unlike anything seen in the entire war. Lee commanded 2 Sherman tanks and 14 American soldiers. Alongside them rode 10 German Wehrmacht troops in a Kübelwagen and a small Mercedes truck. Never before had U.S. forces formally cooperated with German military units in combat operations. The journey to Castle Itter was not without incident. 6 kilometers from their destination, the mixed American-German column encountered an SS roadblock. The engagement was brief but intense. With Besotten Jenny leading the charge, the combined force blasted through the SS position, scattering the defenders. African-American infantrymen riding on the Sherman's rear deck fought alongside German soldiers in the trucks, driving off the Nazi troops in a scene that would have been unimaginable just weeks earlier. When they finally reached Castle Itter, the defenders were greeted by a remarkable sight. French politicians and generals, some of the most prominent figures in European politics, rushed out to welcome their liberators, but turned to concern their relief quickly when they realized how small the rescue force actually was. Fewer than 30 men, 2 tanks, and a handful of vehicles against an estimated SS force of over 150 soldiers. Captain Lee wasted no time in organizing the defense. He positioned his men in strategic locations around the castle's perimeter, taking advantage of the medieval fortifications that had protected the structure for centuries. His Sherman tank, Besotten Jenny, was positioned at the main entrance where its gun and machine guns could provide maximum coverage. The German Wehrmacht soldiers were integrated into the defensive positions, their experience and local knowledge proving invaluable. But perhaps most remarkably, the French prisoners refused to remain passive. Despite Lee's orders for them to take cover, these former prime ministers, generals, and political leaders grabbed weapons and took their places alongside their rescuers. It was an extraordinary scene. American tankers, black infantry soldiers, Wehrmacht troops, and French VIPs, all preparing to fight side by side against the approaching SS assault. As night fell on May 4th, the defenders of Castle Itter prepared for what they knew would be a desperate battle. Intelligence reports suggested that the SS force was larger and better equipped than originally estimated. They had trucks, heavy weapons, and even an 88mm anti-aircraft gun that could easily destroy the Sherman tanks. The odds were stacked heavily against the defenders, but as the first light of dawn began to creep over the Austrian mountains on May 5, 1945, something remarkable was about to happen. The most unlikely alliance in the history of warfare was about to face its ultimate test. The morning mist clung to the valley floor as the first shells began to fall. At precisely dawn on May 5th, the Waffen-SS launched their assault on Castle Itter with a fury that shook the ancient stones. Over 150 elite troops emerged from the tree line like ghosts materializing from nightmare. These weren't the broken remnants of a defeated army. These were fanatics, true believers who saw the defense of the castle as nothing less than treason against everything they held sacred. Georg Bochmann, the SS commander leading the assault, had positioned his forces with tactical precision. His men carried the finest weapons the Reich could still provide: machine guns, mortars, and that devastating 88mm gun that could punch through tank armor like paper. The sound of their advance was terrifying. Boots pounding earth, weapons clattering, and the deep rumble of vehicles moving into position. Inside the castle walls, the defenders heard death approaching. Captain Lee barked orders to his mixed force of Americans and Germans, while the French prisoners checked their weapons one final time. The irony was not lost on anyone. Former enemies now stood shoulder to shoulder, united by something greater than nationality or ideology. They were fighting for human decency itself. The first rounds struck the castle walls with explosive force. Chunks of medieval masonry flew through the air as the SS gunners found their range. Inside the courtyard, dust rained down from the ceiling as each impact sent tremors through the structure. This wasn't going to be a quick skirmish. The SS had come prepared for siege warfare. Besotten Jenny immediately returned fire, her main gun roaring defiance at the attackers. Lee's gunner, Corporal Edward Simsike, proved his reputation as he methodically targeted SS positions. But for every enemy soldier they dropped, 2 more seemed to take his place. The mathematics of the battle were brutally simple. The defenders were outnumbered more than 5 to 1, and ammunition wouldn't last forever. What happened next defied every convention of warfare. As machine gun bullets whined overhead and mortar rounds exploded in the courtyard, former French Prime Minister Édouard Daladier grabbed a rifle and took position at a window. Beside him, General Maurice Gamelin, the strategist who had planned France's early war efforts, loaded magazines and spotted targets for the younger fighters. The language barriers that should have created chaos instead melted away in the heat of combat. Hand signals replaced complex communications. The universal language of war transcended national boundaries. When a German soldier was wounded, an African-American medic rushed to treat him without hesitation. When ammunition ran low in one sector, French politicians carried boxes of rounds to the front lines. Jean Borotra, the tennis champion whose athletic prowess had once entertained crowds across Europe, proved that his reflexes served him well in combat. Moving with the same grace that had made him famous on the courts, he darted between positions, carrying messages and ammunition, while SS bullets cracked through the air around him. His presence alone seemed to inspire the other defenders. If a tennis player could show such courage, how could trained soldiers do any less? The SS assault intensified as the morning wore on. Bochmann's men had established positions in the surrounding hills, creating overlapping fields of fire that made movement within the castle extremely dangerous. Every window became a potential death trap. Every doorway offered an invitation to enemy snipers. The defenders were being compressed into an ever smaller area, their options narrowing with each passing hour. Major Gangl moved through the defensive positions like a man possessed. His transformation from Wehrmacht officer to resistance fighter was complete. Here was a soldier who had fought across half of Europe for the German army, now directing fire against SS troops with tactical expertise earned through years of bitter experience. He understood better than anyone what they were facing. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were ideological warriors who would rather die than accept defeat. The Wehrmacht soldiers under Gangl's command fought with a desperation born of redemption. Every round they fired at the SS was a rejection of everything the Reich had become. Some had family members who had been murdered by the very organization they now fought against. As the sun climbed higher, the battle entered a new phase of intensity. The SS 88mm gun had found its range, and its shells were systematically destroying the castle's defensive positions. Ancient stones that had withstood centuries of weather and warfare were reduced to rubble in minutes. The sound of each impact was like the world ending, a crushing explosion that left ears ringing and hearts racing. Besotten Jenny, Lee's faithful Sherman, absorbed hit after hit while continuing to return fire. Her armor was scarred and dented, her paint blackened by near misses, but her gun still spoke with authority. Inside the tank, the crew worked with practiced efficiency despite the hellish conditions. The temperature inside the fighting compartment soared as they fired round after round at the SS positions. Sweat mixed with cordite smoke created a choking atmosphere that would have broken lesser men, but even the mighty Sherman had limits. When an 88mm shell finally found its mark, the result was catastrophic. The round punched through the tank's frontal armor, sending deadly fragments ricocheting through the crew compartment. Miraculously, most of Lee's crew survived, but Besotten Jenny was finished as a fighting vehicle. Her gun fell silent, and with it went the defenders' most powerful weapon. The loss of the tank sent a shiver of fear through the defensive positions. Without armor support, the castle became far more vulnerable to direct assault. The SS commanders recognized the opportunity and began massing their troops for a final push. This was the moment they had been waiting for. With the American tank neutralized, they could storm the walls and finish what they had started. Inside the castle, ammunition supplies were running dangerously low. Lee counted his remaining rounds and realized they had perhaps an hour of fighting left before they would be reduced to throwing rocks. The radio crackled with static as he attempted to call for reinforcements, but the range was limited and atmospheric conditions poor. His messages were going out, but whether anyone was receiving them remained unclear. The French prisoners, meanwhile, had transformed from political figures into hardened fighters. Léon Jouhaux, the trade union leader whose voice had once swayed millions, now used that same commanding presence to organize ammunition distribution. André-François Poncet, the diplomat who had negotiated with world leaders, applied those same skills to coordinating defensive positions. These men had spent their careers wielding words as weapons. Now they wielded rifles with equal determination. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, the situation became increasingly desperate. The SS had established a complete perimeter around the castle, cutting off any possibility of escape. Their fire was becoming more accurate as they adjusted to the defenders' positions. Casualties among the mixed American-German-French force were mounting, and medical supplies were running low. Every man in the castle understood that they were living on borrowed time. The Battle of Castle Itter stands as history's greatest proof that courage knows no nationality. When evil threatens humanity itself, ordinary people become heroes, enemies become allies, and the impossible becomes inevitable. This wasn't just warfare, it was the triumph of human decency over darkness, reminding us that even in our darkest moments, we can choose to stand together against tyranny,